Hello and welcome. I'm Leonie from Rhinos, and this is Karen Trendler, who will be speaking about raising and rehabilitation of calves. Karen, thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge that you've obtained over the past 30 years.
Hi, Leonie, and all the Run for Rhino people. Great to be with you.
In 1994, you received your first rhino calf. There weren't any research done about raising them. It was basically a mystery and you had to start from the beginning. What was the process you worked to gaining the knowledge you have now?
Leonie, I think I must start off by saying if I knew then what I knew now, I would have been a lot more concerned. It really was ignorance is bliss. But we applied sort of standard rearing protocols, and as you said, there was so little information available. We extrapolated from horses. There was some very old milk composition information available in old zoo yearbooks. So we really just did trial and error to start with. We learned that rhino have very, very low fat, very high lactose. So we really just learned as we went along, carefully monitored the rhino, and then started working with the NCD milk scientists and with Nestle to try and develop better formulas and a more scientific approach. There was very little information at the time on working on premature rhino in the veterinary field. So we approached a human pediatrician who helped us with a lot of information on lung surfactants and the immune challenges that you have with a premature baby. So it really was just trial and error and learning as we went along.
Are there any differences in the way you raise white and black rhinos?
There's not much differences in the way you actually rear them, but you have to be aware of the fact that black rhino are much more sensitive, much more specific to their protein requirements. In the wild white-top browsers, they have a very general requirement of their environment and their diet, whereas black are much more specific, and that impacts on the rearing. So your black are much more sensitive to, for example, vitamin and mineral requirements, protein requirements, and they're much more sensitive and vulnerable to the various veterinary problems. So the black are finicky, the white are tougher.
What are the main conditions and concerns that's common in orphan rhinos?
Obviously, your initial problems are because those rhinos have gone a couple of days without food or water, so dehydration, gastric problems. As hindgut fermenters, they've got those very sensitive guts, just like horses. So gastric problems and preventing rather than trying to sort out gut problems is a big one. They're very prone to stress-induced ulcers. So although they look quite tough and they don't show the signs of pain and distress, pinpoint ulcers and gastric ulceration is very common. So we actually treat preventatively. We assume that a calf has gone through a certain amount of stress, who's had a massive dietary change, who may have been dehydrated. We make the assumption that they are going to be prone to ulcerations. So we actually treat preventatively.
What would be the biggest challenge in rehabilitation of the calves?
I think your biggest challenge is, if you think in the wild, it's a one-on-one bond with the mother for a very, very long time. So you need to try and replicate that. They're relatively easy to rear. They're quite tough. They're quite stoic. Your biggest challenge is because they're so big. So you have them for a very long period. They suckle for 18 months. They're only ready to go back into the wild between 2 and 4 years. They need very strong facilities, lots of care. A baby is 70 kilograms, 80 kilograms, and they double their birth weight in 3 to 6 months. So it's a very big undertaking. You need lots of resources, the time to do it. But rearing a rhino is actually not one of the most challenging of the species to work with. I often say that they survive in spite of what we do and not because of what we do.
Can hand-reared rhino calves be successfully rehabilitated to the wild?
With the right rearing protocols, with the right approach, yes, they definitely can be. We've done a number over the years, black and white, that have gone back into the wild. And the ultimate challenge in successful rehabilitation is not just that that animal can survive in the wild, but that can actually successfully rear its own calf that can breed and rear, and then it becomes a conservation contribution. And yes, it definitely can be done. We've done it a number of times very successfully. I think one of the biggest challenges is not humanizing that rhino too much. So we try and follow nature. It has a one-on-one bond with the mother. So we try and keep a minimum number of carers, and we try and keep the contact with humans to a minimum. So just very close bond with the carers, appropriate surrogate mothering, but minimal contact with other people. And not only is it a risk to have a habituated or a humanized rhino, you know, who then wants to come back to people or chase vehicles, but it also makes them much more susceptible to poaching. You want a wild rhino to run away when it hears human voices or smells humans. Whereas if that rhino has had too much human contact, it's just going to stand and wait.
Does saving the calves contribute or count towards conservation of them?
Absolutely. If you think of the global populations of rhino, the 5 different species, they're all on a massive decline. Poaching has slowed down a little bit, but it's certainly not the end of the poaching. So every single calf that you can rear properly, every single calf that you can keep alive and put back into the population is a percentage of that population. So it's contributing directly to population numbers. But also we're still learning, in spite of the number of calves that have been reared over the years by various organizations and people. There is so much we don't know. So every single calf that gets reared, we're learning more, we're developing our techniques. So there's no doubt that it contributes absolutely directly to the conservation of rhino.
What are the considerations when deciding whether to rescue a calf due to poaching?
Obviously, the age of the calf and the condition of the calf are the most critical. So the lower age classes that are still totally dependent on the mother, that are prone to predation, they have to be rescued and taken into captivity for care. They're not going to cope on their own. When you get to the older calves and closer to weaning, it's much more stressful than to bring them into captivity. So you have to weigh up each rhino and the circumstances. What's the predator density like? Can the owner monitor and watch the calf? Are there other dominant bulls who are going to chase it? And we find with the sort of 18-month-old calves that they're the most challenging. They're the most stressed. So bringing them into captivity is a risk, but also leaving them in the wild is a risk. They sometimes just start running and they won't stop and they won't eat and they won't drink and they just die from stress. So it really is weighing up each and every case. What we try and do with the older calves is not have human contact with them. We try and bring them into a situation and put them with older calves so that they can socialize, they can calm down and encourage each other. So it's a one-on-one evaluation basis.
What about calves that lost their mothers due to natural causes?
I think given the conservation status of rhino, every single calf that we can save without obviously compromising wild rhino is worth saving. And in the last couple of years, there was a huge drought in KZN, and there were a number of drought babies. And calves that are in the uterus during drought are normally much smaller, more immune compromised, and have various problems. We had a tiny little one who was so little, she was a drought baby, she couldn't even reach the mother's teat. And yet with the right care, she was successfully reared. So yes, I think definitely it's worth it as long as you're not compromising a wild situation at the same time. You know, you're not going to dart a healthy wild female in order to retrieve her baby, because then you're putting a breeding female at risk. Whereas if you can retrieve that calf safely and give the calf the best possible chance, that's what you're going to do.
How can we be more involved in conservation?
Well, I think the community that we're talking to now through this discussion, the vets and the vet nurses and those involved directly in conservation are in an incredible position. I mean, we really need veterinary input, specialized input, more learning, more research. For the general public and people on the outside, helping to raise funds, increasing awareness, responsible media and social media use. Sure, there's just so much that direct involved to hand rearing those calves, to getting the funding to support people who are doing anti-poaching. Supporting our rangers is a critical thing if you think what our rangers are doing. So there's a lot that you can do, each and every one of us in our own way.
What would your takeaway message be for the viewers of this interview?
That every calf counts, that if we don't get rhino poaching under control, if we don't stop the demand for rhino horn, our grandchildren are not going to see rhino. And that's not just alarmist, it's very real.
Thank you so much for joining us today and giving us information about all that you've known. I don't even think we picked your brain a little bit to see what you've obtained over the past few years. So thank you very much for what you do for our rhinos and the conservation of them. We really do appreciate it.
It was lovely chatting to you, and all the very best with your project.